Well, hello. Thanks for joining us today. So glad to be with you today with Pastor Kyle as well. And we as a whole Bear Creek ministry team are so excited about this coming Sunday, our Refresh Sunday at Bear Creek, as we regather our age group discipleship ministries. And we have been literally looking forward to this day for months.
Absolutely.
We have missed the chance to gather together in all of our age groups for adults and our grow groups, and to experience the relationships and the transformation that comes as we gather around God's Word and study it together and love one another and care for one another, serve one another, pray for one another. We are glad to be able to begin doing that again in person starting this Sunday on September 13th. And as we do that, we're going to begin studying through the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is a book of prophecy in the Old Testament. It is a massive book about a majestic God. And I am so excited about the study that we're going to be doing this fall. And so I thought I'd invite Pastor Kyle back, and we're just going to have a little conversation about the book of Isaiah to kind of set the table for our study this fall, to get both our hearts and our minds ready to engage with God's Word, to learn all that we can to sort of set things up so that as we're working week by week through different passages in the book of Isaiah, our hearts and minds will be ready for what the Lord wants to teach us. So let's talk a little bit about Isaiah, Kyle.
Yeah, that's just incredibly exciting to be here. Thank you again for inviting me back, that I didn't overstay my welcome the first go around for Virtual Grow Group. But obviously, one of the things I learned in seminary, Scott, and I'm sure you learned this as well, is that context is key, right?
Yes, that's right.
And so helping to, before you read a book of the Bible, helping to set the stage, the background information, the foundation, so that you can kind of know, hey, this is what is happening here. This is the intended purpose of this book. This is the audience of the book. This is ultimately what's happening. And like you said, Isaiah is a massive book, 66 books, in fact, or 66 chapters. I'm sorry. I was thinking in my head that that's how many chapters or how many books the Bible has.
That's right.
Right.
It is, in fact,
Isaiah is a powerhouse, right? And so, Scott, talk to us a little bit about the setting, kind of what's happening in the book.
It's interesting that you say, you made that connection between there's 66 books in the Bible, there's 66 chapters in Isaiah. And there's a number of ways that that's fitting. I mean, I think all of the theology of the Bible somehow finds its way into Isaiah. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but all of the story of the Bible too. Sure. I mean, it has, particularly for an Old Testament book, an amazing scope going from creation to new creation in amazing ways. But you are right, it was revealed in a very particular historical setting mm-hmm. in the 8th century, in Judah, even more specifically in Jerusalem.
Correct.
Speaking to the very specific needs and challenges of that day. And it was a challenging day. I mean, mm-hmm. it was a very difficult time. Now, on the one hand, things looked very good.
Right.
Things were strong. Judah, in the year that Isaiah is called to be a prophet, it says that was the year that King Uzziah died. Mm-hmm. Uzziah had been king over Judah for 52 years.
Wow. So
basically 1/5, more or less, of the time that Israel had had a king, that king had been Uzziah.
Yeah.
I mean, so just this massive reign had reigned over a period of relative prosperity mm-hmm. and peace, even seemingly a time of religious renewal, certainly compared to some of the other chapters in Israel's history. Mm-hmm. And yet all of that is seeming to change really, really quickly.
Kind of like life today. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is very much a book that speaks to our needs today, even though it was written 2,800 years ago.
Right.
So here's the way that the challenges that they were facing. I mentioned that there are all these things that seem to be true. There seemed to be prosperity. Well, the reality is there was prosperity for some, but not for all.
Right.
Because those who had prosperity often gained it at the expense of those mm-hmm. who already didn't have much and end up with even less. So there's widespread inequality and injustice in their society. There's also the problem of peace. There had been a fairly prolonged period of peace, but that's beginning to change mm-hmm. because the Assyrian Empire is rising in the northern part of what is today Iraq, and they are fearsome and savage and cruel. I mean, they are so cruel that the prophet Jonah, when he is told by God to go to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, and preach to them, invite them to repent, Jonah says, these people are terrible. I don't want them to repent.
Right.
I want them to get what they've got coming to them.
Right.
And I know you, God, you're going to want to forgive them, and I don't want you to forgive them, so I'm just not going to tell them about your forgiveness.
Oh, Jonah.
But, and it's easy for us to write that off, but just think about what that says. And anybody in Israel who's reading the book of Jonah completely identifies with him. They're not thinking, well, why was he so harsh on them? No, they knew exactly why he felt that way.
Mm-hmm.
The Assyrians were cruel and savage and ruthless, and they're on the rise, and they are coming soon to a village and town near you. And so they are moving in. And so that prompts then all of these other political machinations in all the kingdoms around. The northern kingdom of Israel that had separated from Judah almost 200 years before. There's the kingdom of Aram or Syria that's also kind of in alliance with Israel, also known as Ephraim. There's just all of these things going on. And so God's people have to ask themselves, well, what do we do in the midst of this chaos?
What's our play here? Yeah.
Who do we look to? Who's going to provide stability for us? Who's going to provide order in our society? Who can just take care of us and keep us safe?
Right.
And so Isaiah begins to speak into these kinds of questions. So that's at the beginning of Isaiah's reign. Uzziah dies. There's a brief reign by Jotham. And then Ahaz, Uzziah's grandson, begins to reign. And so a lot of the first part of Isaiah deals with that reign of Ahaz and this crisis over the rising power in Assyria, led by Tiglath-Pileser III, who has by far the best king name, I think, in the Old Testament.
Tiglath-Pileser.
So, so he's on the march. So Isaiah begins to speak to this. But then 3 decades later, he's still prophesying. He is still speaking to God's people during the reign of Hezekiah. Like Uzziah, a strong king, a worthy king in many, many ways. But these same sorts of challenges are still there. The same problems. And Assyria is resurgent now under Sennacherib. Also, not a bad name. No Tiglath-Pileser III, but still a pretty decent king name. And so again, they're confronted with this challenge of who are we going to trust in? Mm-hmm. Are we going to look to our own power? Are we going to look to friendship with another kingdom who might be able to protect us? Or are we going to look and put our trust in God and God alone? Now, Isaiah even looks beyond just that immediate historical context.
Right.
He looks
to the future.
A century and a half into the future, into the Babylonian captivity and exile, and even the return from exile. And then he looks 7.5 centuries forward to Christ and his coming. And then he looks forward, we'll just have to say year X. We don't know what year that is, but he even looks forward to the consummation of this creation and when God will make all things new. Mm. And so it really is a situation in which Isaiah talks about everything from creation to new creation, but he also talks about it in a way that applies to every moment that we face. Because always we're facing a moment where we have to decide, who will we trust? Who will we put our hope in?
Sure.
How will we wait on the Lord to see him work his purposes in our lives?
Yeah. Wow. I hope you're taking notes because that is an excellent and honestly not even entirety summarization of everything that we need to know about this book. But let's talk about this. So it's no surprise that Isaiah is a prophet, right? Like the very first verse of Isaiah says the vision of Isaiah. So God gives him this vision. He therefore is a prophet. So not just is it important for us to understand background information, but it's also important for us to understand roles of different people.
That's a great point.
In Scripture.
Yeah.
And so what do we need to understand about the role of a prophet? Because it's not just, hey, I believe that God has told me that, the Rice Owls will win the national championship in 2027. That's just me throwing something ridiculous out there. I have nothing substantive, no hard data, nothing to base that upon. A prophet is divinely hearing from God. And so obviously when we talk about communication, we have a message, we have a medium or a channel of communication. And so the prophet very much is that medium of communication. Talk to us a little bit about that. Why is that important that we need to know that at the outset of this study?
Okay. I think that's great because, and I love the example you gave, not because I think it's particularly probable, but because it in some ways highlights a misconception of what we have of what the job of a prophet is,
Sure.
or at least what the most important job of a prophet is. I think a lot of times we think the job of a prophet is to kind of give us tomorrow's news today. We want to know what's going to happen in the future, and it's the prophet's job to kind of get in on the secret and let us know what's going to happen. And certainly, prophets do often do that. And Isaiah, almost as much as any other Old Testament prophet does that. In fact, he over and over in a particular section of the book of Isaiah makes it a point that the reason you can know God is true is because he can tell you the end from the beginning. Mm-hmm. He knows what's going to happen. He's telling it to you now, which is how you can know he's the one bringing it about. Mm-hmm. It's not just luck. It's not circumstance. It's not the power of that people against you. It's not the power of their gods versus your gods. You can know because God is telling you now what's going to happen then. Sure. But that's not just like some sort of religious party trick that a prophet is doing. It's not just for entertainment value. It's not just to, make a better bet on the stock market. There's a different application point. The reason prophets need to tell the future today is so that you can know you can trust their message. Mm-hmm. And therefore, when they're not telling you about what's going to happen in the future, but what they're telling you about what you need to do today in response to the God who controls the future, you can know they're not just blowing smoke. They're not just coming up with their idea of, like you said, I believe I heard this. Mm-hmm. Prophets don't say, I believe I heard this. They say, this is what the Lord says. This is the word of the Lord. Yep. I mean, there's a confidence that comes not because of themselves, because they have heard clearly from the Lord. And they know that his word matters more than anything else. And so they speak it with clarity and with boldness. And they give signs of what's coming in the future simply to authenticate the word that they have for this day. Mm-hmm. And so that's what the prophet is doing. The prophet is speaking not so much about the future, but about the present. And the other thing that we see in prophets as they're talking about the present is that there's often three things that they talk about to God's people. Three recurrent problems that lie kind of at the foundation of all of the problems that we have. One is immorality. Mm-hmm. We simply fail to be obedient to God's commands for our lives. And we do not live lives that live up to his standard of holiness. Yep. And so immorality takes a lot of different forms, and the prophets can be pretty extensive in unpacking what those forms are. Sure. But the problem of personal immorality that violates and dishonors God's holiness comes over and over and over. Okay. The second one is injustice. It's not just concerned about kind of me personally and what I'm doing, but God was also very concerned about how do his people live as a people? How do they live as a community and as a society? And are they living out God's holiness within their society? Mm-hmm. Are they honoring one another as bearers of God's image? Are they demeaning God's glory by demeaning those who bear God's image? Sure. We talked earlier about the injustice, the inequity in society, and how the rich kept getting richer and richer because they would take from the poor. God says, enough of that. I cannot tolerate that way of living. That's unjust, and it dishonors me. That you don't have concern for the poor, for the widow, for the orphan, for the one who has come seeking God's blessing, coming into your community, into your kingdom from outside. Mm-hmm. You're turning them away with indifference. Right. God says that's unjust, and it dishonors me. And so they speak about immorality, they speak about injustice, but at the root of all of it, they speak about idolatry. So it's three I's. It's immorality, it's injustice, it's idolatry. Because at the base of all of our sin, we're saying something else matters more than God. Yep. I give greater worth and importance and attention and affection and trust and hope to something other than God himself.
It's a substitute God.
Yeah. It's a substitute God. It's something that Luther says in his catechism working through the Ten Commandments. What is it to have another God? Well, to have a God is to seek comfort from something, to find satisfaction for your soul, or to take refuge from something in a time of need. And so if we're turning to something for our hope, for our satisfaction, for our protection, for our pleasure, more than we're turning to God, we're turning to an idol. Yeah. And that's at the root of all our sin. And so that's what the prophets speak about. They speak about immorality, they speak about injustice, and they speak about idolatry. And they call God's people to turn away from those things and to turn back to the Lord and to trust him alone.
Yeah, well, and I love the talk about the importance of the prophet, because you think about that role. I mean, not popular, right?
No.
Having the message of God, like you said, the three I's: immorality, injustice, idolatry, communicating that message. Hey guys, I just need you to know that the way that you're living, God's not happy with that. Okay, and obviously we saw what happened with Jonah. We saw that he tried to skirt his responsibilities as a prophet. But I'm also reminded of Jeremiah and how he just talked about the fact that he has this fire in his bones, right? Just this passion of, I have to speak these things. I have to communicate it. And so it's not just, hey, I hate the fact that I'm giving you bad news oftentimes, but it's more of, hey, I want to be faithful to God because he has given me this message to communicate to you. And I think, obviously, that holds so many applications, so many takeaways that hopefully you will see throughout the study of Isaiah, that it's not just having the message, but it's actually communicating it because God has called you to do that. And so obviously when we're looking at the book of Isaiah, we already talked about this at the beginning, it's a long book, 66 chapters.
Yeah, it's huge.
So as succinctly as we can, not trying to skirt through things, but
I feel like you're subtweeting me there. But
I am not subtweeting you.
Okay,
I am just simply, for the people, just trying to give them an overall picture. Because here's what I know. I know that sometimes, now this is not the case for you if you're watching this, because you're watching this and this is that's awesome. But we can very easily fall into the temptation, I've been guilty of this before, of taking other people's words about God and not doing the hard work myself to dig into it. And so really all I say, when I was trying to be succinct about it is just, hey, we want to give the overall picture of this. We want to give the overall, hey, these are some of the sections of this book. But we're challenging you, we're encouraging you, dig into this. I know in the student ministry, we have got a whole bunch of other things that we're going to be focused on, but I'm going to dig into Isaiah myself. That's going to be my September book. Now, you guys are studying it for 13 weeks. I don't know if I have 13 weeks with everything we're doing in the Creek to be able to do it, but I'm going to start reading this myself. So I'm going to kind of be an honorary, well, I was about to say an honorary adult. I am an adult, even though I work with teenagers all the time. I digress. Let's talk about the organization of this book.
Okay, yeah, because it is helpful. When you're in a big area that is unfamiliar, you need a map.
Yes. And
so what I'm trying to provide here is just kind of a map that helps us to locate ourselves at any point in the book, so we can understand what Isaiah is trying to do. And one thing to know is that the book isn't purely chronological.
Sure.
It's not like Isaiah started with chapter 1 and he wrote all the way to chapter 66. Now it is more or less progressive
sequential
in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not purely so. There are some things that Isaiah puts out of order because what's more important to him than the chronology is the thematic and theological development. And so that's why it's also important to kind of know what we're doing. But just as kind of a quick run through, chapters 1 through 5 give an introduction to the book. And there, over and over, Isaiah is introducing, really in the form of almost a covenant lawsuit. Mm-hmm. You say, God is kind of bringing you to court. We had a contract. We had a covenant.
You're not holding it up.
We had a relationship agreement. You haven't lived up to your end of the covenant. Mm-hmm. Here's my legal complaint against you. And so Isaiah just is unpacking that for those first 5 chapters. Then we see, in this desperate situation, I think chapter 6 is the first thing that happens, so to speak, in the book. Mm-hmm. But Isaiah kind of holds that off. He wants us to see how grim things are. And he does that pretty well. Mm-hmm. But then chapter 6, we get Isaiah's call. He has a vision of the Lord in the temple, high and exalted, the King, Yahweh of the heavenly armies, commander of all of the host of heaven. And he comes and he appears to Isaiah. He purifies him from the same sins that all of the people around him are guilty of. And he says, who will be my messenger? And Isaiah says, I will. Send me. And he says, okay, I will. But I'm going to send you to a people, and you're going to speak to them, and they're not going to hear. Mm-hmm. You're going to explain it to them, but they're not going to understand. Their hearts are going to be hard. So go and be a prophet for 4 decades and fail. Now, it's not that God wants him to fail particularly, but he knows his people's hearts. He's calling them to repentance, but he knows that most are not going to respond. But there is a hope. Even there in chapter 6, there's a hope of a remnant There's a stump that's going to be left out of which God promises to once again grow what he later in the book calls an oak of righteousness coming out of the stump of Jesse.
Now, isn't it interesting? This is just an aside, but isn't it interesting that Isaiah waits 6 chapters in to introduce this call? You know, if it's me and I'm going to communicate a tough message to a group of people, I'm going to put my credentials out there at the beginning. Like, hey, just so you know, God's told me to tell you this. This is how he's told me this whole experience that I have, just to give it validity, right?
Yes.
To give it. But this is how we know that this is God's message, because Isaiah just, he doesn't care necessarily about the validity. He just says, God's told me this. These first 5 chapters, like you said, are the I just find that very interesting.
Yeah, and it's a great picture of so many things. I mean, we're probably focusing and diving in too much, but there are so many ways that chapter 6 is a microcosm of the book as a whole.
Sure.
Because you have Isaiah experiencing conviction for his own sin, being a people of being a person of unclean lips among a people who have unclean lips, and so he's really identifying with the sins. He himself needs the same kind of redemption and forgiveness that the people do, that he's just described. But where that comes is an encounter with the holy God who makes a way of forgiveness. And once you've seen that, you forget about yourself because you are no longer at the center of your own universe.
Right.
And Isaiah realizes, my credibility is not what's on the line here.
Right.
I don't have any credibility to speak of except of what God gives me.
Exactly.
And so I'm going to put God front and center. His words are the words that matter. And just like his words in Genesis 1 created the world, his words now are what are going to recreate Jerusalem and Judah and Israel to be the people he has desired for them to be. It's not my words, it's his words. And so I can just speak them with confidence, even in the midst of the chaos around me.
Sure.
Because it's God's words that create the power and the reality that can change things. And so he does. I mean, he very much. And so he speaks into, that's in the year the king Uzziah dies. Stability turns into just chaos very, very quickly. About 5 years later, Judah's facing this crisis. And so now we're in chapters 7 through 12. And this is a series of prophecies that Isaiah gives during a time that was called the Syro-Ephraimite War. So Syria or Aram and Ephraim, the northern 10 tribes of Israel, they make an alliance together because they're trying to resist Assyria. And, they're kind of first stop on Assyria's itinerary because they're in the north. Assyria is going to come. I'm trying to think about this. Here's what's today northern Iraq. Because of the huge, massive desert that's over here, you don't just go on a straight line.
Nope.
You kind of go up and over.
Yep.
And so they're coming down. They're going to hit Aram, then Ephraim, Israel, and then get to Judah. And so they're like, we need to band together. If we're
form an alliance.
Form an alliance. That's right. And so they're trying to coerce Judah to join in their alliance. And Isaiah says, no. You don't need an alliance. You need the Holy One of Israel. He's all the alliance you need. So trust him. Wait on him. He will deliver you. Now, Ahaz doesn't go for that.
Right.
And he ends up, he does resist. He does resist Syria and Ephraim, hence the war and the conflict with them. But the way he resists them is he actually makes an alliance with Assyria. And you can give the bully your lunch money, but he's just going to keep taking your lunch money.
Indeed.
I mean, he may protect you from a lesser bully,
but he's still going to get out of it.
But he still owns you. And so that's the choice that King Ahaz makes. He chooses the bigger bully and doesn't choose to trust in God. So that's kind of the key message there and how that begins to play out. But in those chapters, we begin to get the first taste of Isaiah's amazing prophecies of a child to come who will be the Messiah, the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant.
Help is on the way.
And just some real hope. Now, that hope is way over the horizon from the perspective of Ahaz in the 8th century BC. But there's some signs even then that can give him some hope to wait on the Lord for that moment. So that's 7 through 12. 13 And the following chapters through about 23 are just a series of prophecies about how God is going to judge all of the nations around Israel and around Judah. And how, yes, they're evil and wicked, and they're going to get what's coming to them too, which is why you don't need to be afraid of them.
Mm-hmm.
God is going to judge them. And even if they seem to be winning now,
They
God's
won't be
just
letting
using
later.
them.
Yep.
They're still going to be judged by God. God is in control. Don't lose focus. Keep trusting him. So that's 13 through 23, oracles against all these pagan nations around Judah and Israel. Then we get in 24 through 27 something that's called the little apocalypse.
Oh, that's encouraging.
Yeah. But it is encouraging. Okay, again, we hear the word apocalypse and we think of it in our sense that we use it today of, widespread, irreversible global catastrophe.
Yeah, Will Smith, Armageddon, etc.
Yeah. But that's not the original meaning of apocalypse. An apocalypse originally means an unveiling, an uncovering. It is a glimpse into the future. And this is one of those times that we're beginning to see, not just in the immediate near-term future, but we're seeing way in the future. I mean, what's even still future for us? And Isaiah begins to uncover what it's going to be like when God remakes the world in righteousness and justice and peace, to give us the hope to push through the very, very, very difficult days it will take us to get there.
Yep.
And so Isaiah begins to unpack this, uncover it, unveil it. Well, not him. God has unveiled this
through him.
For Isaiah, through him, reveals it. Isaiah begins to share these amazing passages of hope that come because they need it.
Sure.
Well, then we fast forward about 3 decades and another challenge. Now, by this point, Israel, the northern 10 tribes, have been wiped off the map. Assyria has done with them what it desired. They're wiped out, exiled. Other people have been moved in. There's nothing left of the northern 10 tribes. It's just Judah now. But Assyria is hungry for more. And so now Sennacherib is kind of trying to expand the reach of his kingdom. He doesn't just want tribute money. He wants complete, total control. And so he's on the move. And now King Hezekiah is left with how he's going to deal with this. And so we have some additional prophecies that come in those latter chapters in the 20s leading up through 35 to talk about, again, don't put your trust in kingdoms around you. Trust only in the Lord. And then in 36 through 39, we get kind of the hinge of the whole book. It's Hezekiah facing in many ways the same choice that Ahaz did.
Yep.
How are you going to respond to a crisis that's on your doorstep? Are you going to try to figure it out on your own? Are you going to go running to the strongest guy in the neighborhood, hoping he can protect you, he can take care of you, he'll do what you need to do? Or are you going to trust in the Lord? And in some ways, Hezekiah trusts in the Lord. He doesn't back down when Assyria comes and taunts him and says, where are all the gods that protected all these countries around you? You think your gods are actually any stronger than our gods? And Hezekiah reaches out to the Lord and says, you hear what they're saying. What are you going to do? And God defends his name. And Sennacherib has to go back to Assyria. There's a crisis at home. He has to leave. Judah is spared. But Hezekiah got proud as well.
Yep.
And in his sense of security, he actually invites over ambassadors from Babylon, who at the time was not that great of a power, and says, hey, look at what we got. Look at how much God has blessed us. Aren't we in good shape? And Babylon just starts taking notes. And they remember, oh yeah, Judah, Jerusalem. We ought to look into that sometime. and sure enough, it's a little over a century later about half a century Babylon has conquered Assyria. Then another half century after that, Babylon is knocking on the gates of Jerusalem, saying, yeah, we remember some of that stuff you've got. We'll take that now.
You guys gave us that open house a while back.
Yeah,
we're going to just
great.
take your house now.
Yeah,
we're going
gonna
this
do
is
that.
a forced hostile takeover.
That's right. So that's at chapter 39. Isaiah says, man, that was a bad, bad move, Hezekiah. It's not going to happen in your day, but there's going to come a day where everything you showed them, they're going to carry away from here. Mm-hmm. And so sure enough, it does happen. And so there's kind of this gap between chapter 39 and 40 where all of that history comes. But then chapter 40 opens and Isaiah says, comfort, comfort. He speaks a century and a half into the future to the people who will fall victim to God's judgment because they don't give up their immorality. They don't give up their injustice. They don't give up their idolatry.
Yeah.
And so God eventually judges Judah just like he did Israel. He says, but there's hope for you. I'm going to make a way back. And just like there was an exodus out of Egypt and out of your slavery in Egypt, I'm going to make a new exodus. I'm going to make, just like I opened a way in the sea, I'm going to now open a way in the desert for you to walk back through, to be restored, to come back to the land. I'll renew my covenant with you out of my grace and my love for you. And so this is what Isaiah does in chapters 40 through 55. He just unpacks God's amazing new Exodus grace for his people. But there's something interesting, though, that happens there, because Isaiah, as he's looking into the future, he remembers the warning he got in his call.
Yep.
And he knows that the people of a century and a half from now aren't going to be any better
Nope.
than the people that he's preaching to now. And while exile will change them, it's not going to change them from the heart.
Right.
There's still the issue. Something has to come from outside them. The coal has to touch the lips. In some way, God has to take away their sin.
Sure.
Some way, their sins have to be atoned for. And so it's in these chapters, in 40 through 55, that we not only hear this hope of return from exile, but we begin to look even beyond that. Not just to a child who will come and who will reign on the throne of David, but we hear about a servant, the servant of the Lord, who will come to redeem God's people by giving his own life away as a sacrifice and an atonement for their sins. And so here, all of the things that we begin to see just in a glimpse in those early chapters of Isaiah become much more vivid as we see the ministry of the Messiah, the ministry of the suffering servant as he comes in Jesus Christ. And then following that, in 56 through 66, Isaiah just blows open the doors with hope. And he says, but when he comes, he is going to change his people. And he's going to change them from the inside out.
Yep.
So that they will actually begin living not lives of immorality, but lives of holiness. And their society won't be one of injustice. God's people will actually, from their hearts, want to live lives of love and charity and generosity and care, especially for the least among them. They won't be a people who have to guard their borders. They'll be welcoming people into the family and people of God. And then ultimately, there won't be any idolatry, because God himself will come and live among his people. And his glory will so radiantly outshine any rival to his kingdom that there won't be any desire to worship anything else. People will want to worship God and God alone. And so that's what we ourselves look forward to. I mean, we are still living in the anticipation of the fulfillment of those prophecies. But Isaiah's already given them to us to motivate us to live today in light of that future hope.
Yeah.
Well, I think the first one that you have to start with, because again, this is the one that captivates Isaiah more than any other, is the majesty and magnificence and holiness and glory of God himself. That there is no one like God.
Right.
That he alone is worthy of worship. He alone is worthy of trust. He alone is sovereign over the affairs of nations and men. God is in control, and he is worthy of our worship. And so just the bigness and the greatness and the awesomeness of God is a dominant theme throughout the book of Isaiah.
That's theme number one.
Yes, so that's theme number one. A second important theme is that judgment is coming, but salvation is coming too. One of the amazing things about Isaiah is that almost every time he mentions judgment, he knows they need to hear about the judgment. He knows they need to hear about judgment because that will call them to repentance. It's like he can't help himself but also speak about God's desire to forgive. And there's this amazing verse in Isaiah 28 where he talks about God's strange work. And what he means by that is, because of God's heart for his people, it's strange to him to judge them, to punish them, to discipline them, because that's not his heart. That's not his desire. His desire is to bless them and to redeem them, to embrace them. He does his strange work of judgment to clear the path for him to do the work that he loves to do in blessing his people and revealing himself to them. And so we see judgment, but we also see a hope of salvation. And even Isaiah's name means Yahweh is salvation. So I mean, it's just right there in the name,
right there in front
right there from the beginning. This is a book about God's salvation. But that salvation will come through judgment. And we see that not only in the history of Israel, but we see that in Jesus himself. That the way God is able to bring salvation to us is through judging our sin on the cross, showing how absolutely wicked and horrid it actually is, that it required that cost to pay for it. It's interesting, the first part of the book is kind of a tale of three kings. You know, we have Uzziah mentioned, at least kind of name-checked there in 6, then Ahaz, then Hezekiah. We have these three Davidic kings, some of whom show more promise than others, but none of them who live up to the hope of what has ultimately been promised to David, a king who will reign on his throne forever in righteousness and justice. And so it begs the question, so who's it going to be? Who will be this king? And so always Isaiah is looking forward to the coming of the Messiah. And to my mind tells us more detail about the coming of the Messiah than any other singular Old Testament book. I mean, it's not the first reference. It's not, I mean, I think the first reference is all the way back in Genesis 3.
Right.
It's not the first reference. It's not even using the word Messiah. I'd have to go back and think. I don't know that he actually ever uses the word Messiah, interestingly. But it's there all throughout the story. So much so that the early church fathers often referred to Isaiah as the fifth gospel. Because they didn't think you could read it without the story of Jesus being on virtually every page. And so to them, it was as much a telling of the gospel as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John was. It was just a gospel that was written 7.5 centuries before Jesus got here. So it's an amazing story of the Messiah and what God has done through him.
So we've got the uniqueness, majesty, holiness of God.
Yeah.
We've got judgment that ultimately produces hope. Kind of that bad news, good news, really, really, really good news situation. We've got the Messiah. Give me the other two. What are the other two key themes?
Yeah, the other key themes are the nations. Isaiah, while he was a prophet to Judah and Jerusalem, God's own covenant people, he spends a lot of time talking about the other nations. But he does it in a way that's maybe a bit surprising. He, on the one hand, condemns them. That's not the surprising part.
No.
No Judahite of the 8th century would have been surprised that these people deserved God's judgment.
Right.
But what is amazing is that Isaiah says, yeah, and just like you've got hope, so do they.
Right.
I mean, he in these amazing passages talks about how Egypt and Assyria and Israel, historically, Israel's two greatest enemies and Israel itself, one day all three will call on the name of the Lord together. And so, yes, there's judgment, but there's also hope for redemption.
Right.
And we see over and over in the New Testament how the New Testament writers look to Isaiah to understand what God was doing in Jesus, not just to renew Israel, but to take this message of good news to all of the peoples of the earth. Yeah, the last key theme, I think, is the response that these prior 4 themes require of us, and that's trust.
Yes.
Over and over and over, Isaiah calls on the people to trust. And there's a great moment where Isaiah boldly challenges the king himself in the face of this crisis. And he says to King Ahaz, if you don't stand firm in faith, you won't stand firm at all. And over, there's just verses like that where he calls us to trust in the Lord, to stand firm in faith, to wait on the Lord. All of these are to be our posture towards God. And so we're to leave behind idolatry, immorality, injustice, and wait and trust and hope in the Lord. And so over and over, Isaiah calls us to that. And not in a way that condemns, but in a way that invites.
Yeah.
It says, here's comfort, here's fullness. You're thirsty, you're hungry. Come and be filled. I mean, that's the invitation that we have when we trust the Lord. And all the hopes and all the desires that we have are going to be met in this holy, majestic God, the Holy One of Israel, as Isaiah calls him 26 times in this book. So I think those are the 5 key themes that we're seeing all throughout all these sections that he comes back to over and over again.
Okay, well, let's wind this down. And really one of the last things that you said was actually a perfect segue, so we will pick up there. But you may be watching this thinking, well, why are we studying Isaiah? Why not another book? Could have chosen 65 others. Why Isaiah? And I think something that you said at the tail end of talking about the key themes was just this idea of trust, and how there are a lot of parallels in what Isaiah was speaking into to the people here, and a lot of parallels to how we are living and what life is like now. So why Isaiah? Why now?
Well, I think you're right. That theme of trust is so important, because I think so often in a time like we're experiencing right now, in the decades-long year of 2020.
Yeah, I've got my mask right here. It's crazy. This is crazy.
What we want to say is make it go away.
Mm-hmm.
Make it stop.
Let's go back to normal.
Yeah. Just make it go away.
Yeah.
But what God, I think, wants to say to us right now, what he wants to answer us, is to say the sign that he gives in Isaiah 7. Emmanuel, God is with you. So what God wants to say to us, even in these days, is we're saying, make it go away. He's saying, I'll do you one better. I won't make it go away, but I'll come to you. And I will be with you.
That's good.
And here's the thing. God could make it all go away. But if he doesn't come to be with us, we're really not any better off.
No.
Something else is going to fill the vacuum of pain and difficulty and challenge and problem until God comes, and he is all in all for us. And so I want us to read Isaiah and to know Isaiah, and even more to know Isaiah's God, because we need Isaiah's God. When you live in times of trouble, you need gospel hope like Isaiah knew, and you need a God who's as big as the God that Isaiah knew. And so I want us to know that God. I want us to hear those things that Isaiah would say to us, to call us to not trust any other God. To hear God say to us, I am not going to give my glory to anyone else. Yep. So shape up, get on the team, give me your glory, because it's in that I'm going to be working for you and fulfilling everything that you could possibly desire or imagine. I'll blow your minds with who I am for you. So turn to me. And so I want us to see that. And even as I mentioned with the early church fathers calling Isaiah the fifth gospel, I think sometimes our instinct in a time like this is, things are really tough. Let's just read an Old Testament prophet. That's going to really cheer us up.
Yeah, by comparison, we're doing okay.
Well, we probably wouldn't feel that if we actually understood what they're saying.
We would not. That was the point of what I said.
Yeah, we're gonna feel the pain. But the reality is, I think the New Testament writers, the early church understood, we can't understand who Jesus is without understanding the Jesus that Isaiah prophesied. Mm-hmm. We need to know Isaiah to really know Jesus.
Yep.
And which is why, other than Psalms and perhaps Deuteronomy, depending on how you count it, Isaiah is quoted more in the New Testament than any other book of the Old Testament.
Wow.
It is just there over and over and over, because it's so important for us to understand who Jesus is and what he has come to do for us. And so I want us to be able to see those things. And just to see, again, a big, massive God. The God who is so big, Isaiah says, that the universe fits in the span of his hand. But a God who also is attentive to each one of us, such that he has inscribed our names in love on his palm.
It's a really big hand.
And a God who is the Holy One of Israel, who is high and exalted and lifted up, so big that his toe is all that can basically fit into the temple.
It's a big toe.
but yet he's also the God high and lifted up, but who delights to be with the one who is lowly and broken and contrite and repentant. And so we need to see Isaiah's God, the big and the majestic, but also the tender and the compassionate, the one who carries his children like a shepherd would carry a young lamb. We need to know that God, who is excellent for all of his diverse attributes. It almost seemed contradictory that a God that big and powerful could be that tender and compassionate and caring. We need that God. And so I want us to spend the months of just soaking this in. Again, not to know Isaiah, but to know Isaiah's God.
That's a very, very important distinction. I love that you said that. So we kind of talked a bit about this at the beginning, but just to make sure that everybody's on the same page, what is this going to look like for the fall? Just kind of finish us up talking about that.
Yeah, so what we're going to be doing, and again, this is coming up this Sunday. We're going to start working in Isaiah beginning in chapter 1, working our way through beginning this Sunday through the fall. And our groups are going to be meeting back on campus. Now, not all of them are. Some of them just because they're predominantly folks who are in particular age or stage of life where they're perhaps more susceptible to catching the virus, and it's wiser for them to take a little bit longer in returning. So some of our groups are going to continue to meet in Zoom only for right now. But for most of our groups, we're going to have options both to meet on campus and on Zoom starting this Sunday. And so the first thing I'd encourage you to do is to go to our Bear Creek website, go to bearcreek.church/growgroups, find out the details for your group. If you need an updated Zoom link to begin connecting with your group for this study, you can find that there at the website. If you need to know what room number you're in, we're trying to move groups around to be in slightly safer spaces so that we can have appropriately distanced seating in all of our rooms. Go to the website. If you haven't already heard from your group, go to the website, find out what room you're going to be meeting in this Sunday. But we're going to begin going through for 13 weeks, studying 13 key passages in the book of Isaiah. In future weeks, Lord willing, I'm also going to be offering some brief devotionals, not on those particular passages, but trying to fill in some of the gaps that we're just going to have to leave because you can only cover so much over 3 months. And so I want to maybe at least give us brief glimpses at some of these other beautiful passages in Isaiah and just reflect a little bit on those devotionally with you each week. And, a 7 to 10 minute devotional video that we'll post online as well. So that's going to be our plan. Grow groups on Sunday morning, some devotionals coming during the week to help us work through Isaiah. Just as one more invitation for those of you who are ready, who feel comfortable coming back, you feel like that's a wise choice for you, we will be so glad to see you this Sunday. And when you arrive, we have something for you that we think is going to help you study. We actually have, for this particular study, something called the Daily Discipleship Guide. So I've got 125 copies of this that I am eager to give away to the first folks who are back here ready to join a Grow group on campus. It's going to give you some additional materials so that you can be studying as well through the week, getting ready for the lessons on Sunday, really consolidating what you're learning about who God is and about his call for you to trust him. And so I'm going to invite you to come on Sunday, to meet back up with your Grow group, to get a copy of this Daily Discipleship Guide. But whether you are on Zoom or in the room, what I want to encourage you to do is to connect with your brothers and sisters. Turn your attention to the book of Isaiah and fix your gaze on the Holy One of Israel, who captivated Isaiah for his whole life and who changed the course of his life and who in Jesus Christ has changed the course of human history. So let's look to him now in this season and find him to be everything that we need to find that we can put our trust in him. I'll look forward to doing that with you over the next 3 months. We'll see you on Sunday.